Hi everyone, thank you for waiting. So without further delay, please join me in welcoming Ofer on stage.
So thanks everyone for joining me this afternoon, still not afternoon, this morning, to learn a bit more about, well, hacking plugs or outlets. Without further ado, I'll say a word about myself to qualify why I can speak about that, and then I'll get straight to things. So my name is Ofer Shezaf. In recent years, I joined the bad guys, which means I'm now a corporate guy. If you've seen me yesterday, I've been with a suit because I had to go see customers. I'm a product manager these days. But I used to do research, and I ran research for Fortify, and before that for a smaller company called Breach Security. And my core area of expertise is actually application security. I founded the Israeli OWASP chapter. I actually had a chance to speak yesterday in the Dutch OWASP chapter meeting. If somebody here doesn't know what OWASP is, I'll mention it again because the comparison to this conference is interesting and relevant. And I also am pretty active in community and open source projects around application security. I wrote the Mod Security Core Rule Set, which is one of the only available signature set out there for web application firewall or IPSs. And today I run a project called the Web Application Firewall Evaluation Criteria. Since all of those are community open source projects, I do encourage you to look into them and join. As a fun fact, I come from Israel. Usually it's very unique. In this conference, I'm probably the 5th speaker from Israel, so it's not that unique, but there is something unique. I don't live in Tel Aviv, which is the center of the country. I live far, far north. And actually the closest airport to my house is in Damascus, Syria. I've never been there. I don't have any plans to go there. You've read the papers. It's not that safe. I also read the papers. That's the only thing I know about Syria. We'll get to this thing about living 50 kilometers from a war zone and still feeling safe later on in the presentation. I'm glad to speak about charging electric cars in particular and the smart grid in general here in Amsterdam because the Netherlands is a very early adopter of electric cars. What I didn't mention before is that the reason I can speak about charging and the security of charging is that in between doing research and product management for security product, I spent 3 years working for a company that did infrastructure for charging electric cars. The company is Better Place. It's an upstart that raised more than $1 billion to install infrastructure for charging electric vehicles. This thing here is actually it's Schiphol Airport. You may see it when you go there, if you go to the airport today or tomorrow, if you fly out. It's not for charging cars, it's for switching batteries to cars. One of Better Place ideas was that since electric cars can go only around 150 kilometers on one battery, if you want to drive more, you'll just go to a place like that and your battery will be switched. So you'll get a new battery and you can go on. So I was actually, until I left probably 2.5 years ago, on the team building this interesting site. And when I was here probably twice along, when I was working for Better Place, one of them was a whole week of a standards committee on securing the communication between cars and charging stations. And actually, at the time, 3 or 4 years ago, charging stations were very rare. By the way, as a question, anybody here has electric car? Whoa, 3, that's a lot. Anybody never saw a charge station? That's nice. Most of you are Dutch, I guess. There are many here. So when I came here, I actually did a tour of the city, not to see the canals, but to see the charge stations. And the pictures here are pictures I actually took here 3 or 4 years ago of the first set of charging stations in Amsterdam at the time. Okay, what are we going to talk about today? So, unfortunately, or fortunately, because I think it's very interesting, but it's not very security related, I'll have to spend a bit of time on smart charge. Why do we need more than just a simple outlet to charge our cars? Because of course the security risks come from the fact that we need to smart charge and we need a whole computer to help us charge our car. So we'll have to spend a bit of time on that. Later on, I'll go into the security part. I'll discuss vulnerabilities. I know that's the most interesting part always, you know, the actual hacking stuff. That said, you heard a lot about it in the last couple of days, and I'll say a few new things. I'll say a few things which are sort of common to every system. So if you saw somebody hacking a Canon camera because it has an Ethernet port, I'll show you the charge station also has an Ethernet port. And it will be similar in a way. So I want to spend some time there and show you how to hack. But I don't want to end there. I want to continue beyond that. One important aspect that we need to discuss and understand, being back the corporate guy, is what is the real risk? Why should we care? Why bother? Lastly, there's a section that I actually added last night or this morning. Because, you know, coming to this conference, I found out that there are so many talks about hacking physical things, you know, from airplanes to cellular networks to alarm systems to cameras. And then I thought, but I never hear any real-world hacks around that. Why is that? And I want to touch a bit on that, and I'll get pretty far away, and I'll mention Charles Darwin for a moment, so it might be interesting. And there's limits to how far Bluetooth can work. Okay, smart charge electric cars. Why do we need to smart charge? Why can't we just get home, plug to the wall, and get electricity into our car? So there are a few challenges out there. That's one challenge. The first one is that we need to charge on the streets and in parking lots. So everyone who's been traveling around trains or airplanes know that it used to be very hard to find plugs out in terminals and in train stations. It's a bit easier today, it's still a challenge. In the streets, you just don't have them. So unless you're able to just charge at home, and unless you have a private home, you need sockets, outlets on the streets, which you don't have today. Moreover, somebody has to pay for the electricity there, so you need a way to bill. I want to say to charge, but it's the same word, so to bill for using those outlets. But this is not the only issue. There's a huge issue with the amount of electricity needed. It's not an issue today. It is actually an issue today. We'll touch on that a bit. But if a third of the cars in the Netherlands, let's say, I'm guessing, 3 million cars would be electric, each one of them would take 32 amps when charging. You'll do the calculation, you'll get to something which is more than the European power supply. It's a lot. So there's a challenge there. But the challenge is not only on national level, the challenge is also on local level. You have an employee parking lot. People come there in the morning, they need to charge in order to be able to get back home. However, if all of them charge at the same time, there won't be enough current in the incoming electricity connection to provide electricity to them all. So something has to be done in this respect. Lastly, why do we want electric cars in the first place? We want electric cars in the first place because we want greener environment. But electricity, at the end of the day, is also made of something in a process that may not be green. So in order to justify electric cars, we need to make sure that the electricity we provide them is green. Now, green electricity today is challenging because it's not when you want it, it's when it's available. So there's wind power, there's solar power. Have you been out today? No solar power, at least here. Wind is usually something that happens at night and not during the day, or more of it. So we want to make sure that cars are charging when green energy is available. One of the biggest advantages of electric car is that it's a huge battery. And as a result of being a huge battery, it can actually charge when there is, rather than when the electricity is needed. Even more than that, if you never heard about it, there's a long-term plan or vision to use electric cars as a buffer. So not just to have the electric cars charged at the right time, but actually to enable electric cars to provide electricity back to the grid. So if you have a car, you have a large battery because from time to time you do go to Den Bosch. But usually you just travel, from the suburbs, suburbs here to the city, so you get to work and you still have 80% of your battery full. So during the day you stand there in the parking lot, you connect to the charging station, and you can get more electricity, the rest of the 20%, but you can sell the electricity in your battery back to the grid. Having all those 3 million batteries out there is a caution to regulate or to enable more use of green power. So just to summarize this part, the visionary one without any technology in it, as a customer, if I'm not into green energy, I want to get electricity now, to pay minimum, and to make it easy. And it's not that easy, keep in mind. You have to, whenever you get anywhere and you park, you have to take the cable out, plug to the charge station, plug to the car, swipe an RFID card for the payment part. It's more than just getting out of the car and going anywhere. On the other hand, the charging process has to take to consider the local capacity of the parking lot or the area where you park, national or international capacity, green power, and lastly, which I didn't mention, there's also the aspect of managing the battery life. I mean, you have a lot of mobile devices and they have batteries, and those batteries usually die after a year, and then you throw them away and buy a new one. Because it's, I don't know, 10 euros, 20 euros. An electric car battery is 10,000 euros, so you don't want to throw it away after 1 year. So you need to make sure that you charge it the right way. Specifically, it's around temperatures. You don't want to charge it when it's still too hot or too cold, stuff like that. Okay, so we need smart charging. So I don't want to get to the details of this slide, but smart charging starts to be a complex IT system. It has a lot of elements in it. There is a utility, there's the company that generates and distributes the electricity, and they know how much is available nationally and in many cases also locally. Then there is someone who might be a different company, might be the same company who's in charge of the charging services, who actually is connected to each charging spot and determine the charging plan, which we'll discuss in the next slide, going to each car. Then you have the driver who's making the request for charging, connects, and usually would like to have additional services we usually touch upon in order to check billing, to check remotely if there is enough power when you come back to the car, etc., etc. So a mobile app would always be also needed. And then we have the charge spots themselves, which are distributed around. In many cases, they'll be at homes, so private parking positions. So it will belong to someone. In many other cases, they will be managed as groups. So you'll have corporate parking lots, commercial parking lots. Your mall might have a few charging stations available there. I mentioned where it would be. I just would like to mention that the requirements for each one of those charging positions is different. When you get home, you have the entire night and you want it to be full the next morning. When you get to work, some employees stay all day, some are salespeople, they need electricity fast. When you get to a shopping mall, if you need electricity, you need it now. So someone has to generate a charge plan. Somebody has to smartly manage charging based on customer requirements and availability to essentially drive national use from something like that, which usually when people come home and plug, would just burst the network into something manageable that in this simple case would just delay the charge of most cars from immediately when they come home into the early hours of the morning, which is the simplest case of managing charge nationwide. So each car would have some charging plan. It means that it starts now, gets enough, so it's not empty, stop, waits till the morning, etc., etc. All those are pretty complex systems that would require some smart charging mechanism, somebody central to manage that. One thing to keep in mind, this smart charging, if I go back to the slide of pros and cons of who wants what, is a requirement, is a national requirement. It's a society requirement. The personal requirement is to have electricity now as fast as possible, nearly always. So there's also a question of how to balance those needs, which would usually be based on pricing. If you're willing to get electricity later, you'll pay in one way or another less. So let's get to the meat. So in order to implement this concept, there is something called a charge station. Those are 4 different kinds of charge stations. Those are just different colors. They are made by companies, usually large electric equipment companies. I'll mention General Electric later in a not so positive way. So at least they have the nicest ones here on the left. And the rest are other companies. Siemens are doing charge stations. Sorry? Okay. It is starting to become a commodity, though as I'll show later, it's a bit too early for that, due to security issues. So, what is a charge station? Essentially a charge station, and I choose one that looks the way I wanted it to look, but is a real one, is a computer on the street. It has an LCD, it has some interface, and it has a cable. It has also electrical parts, but it is a computer on the street. Let's look at the details of this charge station. So it has 2 sides to it. One of them would be the electronics, the computer. The other side would be the electrical part. They do interact between them. Though I need to say that on the security part, this is the part where people do take care of security. I'll say a bit about it later on. On the computer part, you'll have some main board. More and more, it's a general purpose, at least ARM-based computer. Good chances to run Linux, if not some other embedded operating system. Some of them do run proprietary controller level software, but it doesn't scale. When you want a screen of that size and you want to use cheap available technology, you'll get to use standard technology here, which will force you to essentially Linux-based systems. As a peripherals, you'll have some sort of UI. In high-end systems, it will be a LCD. In lower-end systems, it might be just a buzzer, LED, something like that. One thing worth mentioning, I don't discuss it later on in the presentation because it's sort of another area, is that some of them, not a large number, accept credit cards, which gets you into the old credit card security world and automated vending machines, which is just another subject worth a whole different presentation. You'll always find, nearly universally, you find RFID as the identification and activation mechanism. And then you need some communication back home. There are different ways to do that. We'll discuss a few of them. I want to say something important about all that stuff. One of the driving factors that will influence the level of security is cost. This is commodity products, and they are there on the streets. There are many of them, and they need to be cheap. And because they need to be cheap, they may not be what you would have chosen for security reasons. I'll give you a good example. So whoever stays in this hotel probably has such a card. I already checked out, so I might not have the card with me. Here it is, RFID. So this card is something that I already checked out, I didn't give it back. So I had a reason I wanted to show it in the presentation, but most people don't. So it has to be very cheap. If it costs €2, it's much better than if it costs €5. As a result, those cards, and we'll discuss it later, are usually not the latest technology. And in many cases, they are hackable. So while it's not hard, and you can buy even off-the-shelf secure components, in many cases, people use non-secure components. Another example we'll see, so I'm writing here GSM, Wi-Fi, Zigbee, and RS, which is serial connection. Generally speaking, GSM would be the most secure, but it's very expensive to have a GSM connection for each one of the charge spots. And therefore, in many cases, you'll see that a number of charge spots which are located in the same place are connected by serial connection, which we'll discuss in a moment, and have just a single GSM connection to the network. And this serial connection is a major vulnerability. On the electrical side, I just want to mention two elements. There's the meter, the electricity meter. I won't go into details, but of course, one of the fraud cases, it is digital and it does communicate digitally with the main computer. So metering fraud is an easy way, when we'll see later on, to actually pay less. The other side is the RCD, the protection mechanism. Usually it is well protected from the electronics, so you don't just play with it from the computer side of things. There is an interesting aspect to that, which is around the safety side of information security. When you have a breaker, it has to jump, it has to open the circuit if there is any danger for execution. So if something goes wrong, it has to, and you have all of you have those protection circuits at home, and they go down, and then you go and take it up. There is a regulation in every country that it has to be local. Somebody has to go there and take up the protection circuit. Unfortunately, this is very expensive when it gets to sending a technician to take it up anywhere in the city. It can cost you up to €200 just to fix a small thing. So there is a tendency to try to have it remotely controlled, but this becomes an information security hazard, because that means that if any of the vulnerabilities I show later becomes true, people may be able also to play with the safety element of the electrical circuit. Okay. One thing to keep in mind is that it's not just a computer on the street, it's a network on the street. I mentioned that it's connected. In many cases, a few of them are connected locally, and then through some wide area connection, either to a control center belonging to a transport operator, or in other cases, locally to the building management system. So there are cases where a vendor is selling to a company 5 or 10 charge stations to put in the corporate parking lot, and then they're not connected anywhere, but they're connected to a management system at the company, which just makes sure that the local limit on charging is not exceeded. So that's networking. Okay, and now what you've been waiting for, vulnerabilities. I'll put it this way. I knew where to look, and we'll discuss it later in the philosophical part of things. I designed such systems, so I knew where they're vulnerable. I tried to find publicly available examples in which I can show you this without compromising anything. After all, I work for HP, and they don't like it if I just disclose vulnerabilities. And we'll get to that part of I knew where to look. We'll discuss later why it doesn't happen so much. So the first issue is physical access. Those are systems on the streets, and it's very easy to get to the computer itself. Taking them apart is very easy. Two ways: you can just go there to the street, and the other way is to buy the equipment. And I think in the other presentation I've mentioned about hardware hacking. You heard about both those methods. When you actually get your hands on the equipment, reverse engineering it is usually much easier than one would think. The CPUs themselves have debug ports, and for example, if you look at this board, which is from a parking meter in this example, it has no epoxy, which is usually the mechanism to prevent reverse engineering of electric circuits. So if you go to a highly secure modules, such as those that store keys in banks, they'll have epoxy on top of key electrical elements to protect them from reverse engineering. Nothing here. So in most digital circuits I've seen in embedded systems, the debug ports of the processors are available, and once you open it, you can connect easily to the debug ports. Another interesting method, pretty sophisticated one for the same smart cards I showed before, is X-ray. I mean, I'll show you an example later on, a smart card which I was able to know the make of, and therefore I was able to get more information about without X-ray. But if you have nothing, and I checked, there's nothing here about the make of the card, probably if I'll X-ray it, I'll know very easily what is it and what are the vulnerabilities within it. Why would reverse engineering work? So first of all, physical access work. First of all, it's a great eavesdropping point. It enables harder man-in-the-middle attacks. So if I connect to the CPU and I do a breakpoint on the software in the controller, I can stop execution midway. And I can, for example, get the identity used in order to identify the person for billing purposes. The other thing is that, we'll get to that later, like every security mechanism, there will be keys involved in securing communication and billing. And in most cases, if you get access to the hardware, you'll get the keys out. The keys used for this RFID card I just mentioned. We'll look at that a bit later on. Another vulnerable point is serial communication. You have a parking lot. You want to install there 50 charge stations. You want to connect them. It's way too expensive to just have an Ethernet cable going to each one of them. I don't know if anyone of you is doing IT, but it's a few hundred euros per connection and a lot of wiring. And it's not a typical environment for wiring. So many times what's actually used for that is something called RS-485, which is a multi-drop version of RS-232, which some of you still may remember. A very old. Once every printer and mouse were connected to the computer this way, I don't think I have a serial connection anymore. No, I don't have one. But those systems still use them. The advantage is that it's a multi-drop system, so you can connect one cable, which you can just put alongside the electrical cables, which you anyway need. I mean, a charge station needs a connection to electricity after all. And by that way, you get connectivity to all of the stations very easily. The challenge is that this is a very, very, very low bandwidth system. When you have a 1,000-meter cable, which is not unheard of when you have to go to 3 floors inside a parking lot to get to the corners you selected in order to put charging stations, you get to as much as 100 kilobits per second for all of them. Sure. So that's not a lot of information. I don't know who here ever had to design protocols or develop anything for such low frequencies. I'm the only one old enough here. Oh, you're not old enough, but you made a chance. It's very limiting. It means that a lot of the things that we are so used to as far as security goes are not possible. Moreover, RS-485 by itself is just an electrical standard of serial communication. You need some protocol over it. What's usually used is something called Modbus, and Modbus is still a very, very simple protocol. Essentially, it's used to make sure that the master is splitting time between the different stations because you don't want anyone to work at the same time, and it doesn't have any security. So an upper level application may add security, and usually it does. My experience is that usually authentication is secured, but information is not. So, for example, you would be able to get the ID or the information about who's charging, even if you won't be able to emulate who's charging. That said, it's all proprietary, it's all invented by the vendor, and man-in-the-middle attacks are usually very easy. Just connect in the middle. Electrical diagrams for RS-485 are available anywhere, and you will be able to do nearly everything, if it's encrypted at all. Next, RFID. RFID is worth a discussion. RFID by itself is not an insecure technology. A lot was already said. You can, again, a whole new world of security worth an entire presentation, but I do want to spend a few minutes on that. There are few, when you say RFID, or I should actually say contactless smart card, you imply one of several standards. The first one would be ISO 14443. This is the most secure standard, or the potentially most secure standard, and a lot of implementations today do use it. If you have PayPass or PayWave credit card, contactless credit card, it would be based on this technology. An alternative technology, ISO 15693, has the advantage that it works from a bit further. So it's contactless is not really contactless. Contactless is insertless. It has to be very close to actually work. ISO 15693 works from a bit further, so the usability is better, but it has less power. Keep in mind that contactless smart cards, the card processor works on the energy received from the air. So if you go further, you can have less electricity, less energy, and you can do less. So you can't really have a smart processor there. So you'll probably have just at the best secured memory. I'll discuss it a bit in the next slide. Lastly, there are tons of, I say older, but I should probably say cheaper, memory-only, really RFID devices. You know, just reading an ID from remotely with no security, and there are implementations that actually use those. So, first of all, it's very easy to eavesdrop. I have a link here to an interesting project that shows you, actually let you buy the equipment to eavesdrop, to listen from even a bit further than the actual card is used to the actual traffic between the card and the reader. So if there is any insecure protocol, it's very easy to break, and I'll talk about that in the next slide. The one other thing which is worth mentioning is that smart cards are a blocking point for fixing any system. They are widely distributed, they are not patchable in the field, so you'll have to replace all of them essentially at the same time with updating all the readers in order to fix anything. So they are one of the reasons that, like a lot of physical systems, if you have an issue in the field, it's going to stay there. Just as an example, a very local one, the smart card, the contactless smart card used by the Dutch public transportation, the OV cards, have been known to be hackable since 2008 or something like that. And I think that last year they started replacing them. So they've been known to be hackable for 4 years. There's a good question is why the risk? Why the risk? Nobody. There was no huge financial loss due to that, which I'll get to in the philosophical part at the end. But it's just hard. It's hard to replace physical cards. Let's go on to cryptography. So, at the end of the day, the goal of these contactless smart cards is to do one of two things. Either to provide authentication, to provide an ID in a secure manner. Secure manner means that only the card holder can identify this ID. Nobody can just copy the card. Keep in mind that a magnetic stripe card is just copyable. There's no way to protect it. The other application, the other way to use a smart card is using stored value. So to store some money there, an electric wallet, so to speak. And car charging applications may use either, both. It's small money, so it might be stored value. In many cases, it is based on identification. Now, I'll leave alone for now those smart cards that have no encryption, and there are systems that use them. I'll go to those that do use encryption. The most common way to use encryption in smart cards is to use a shared key scheme in which both the reader and the card know the same key. The diagram here, which is not very complex, I'll get to it. I probably won't get to it now, but if you have any questions, come to me. It's not very complex. Is how it's done. It's a challenge response mechanism between the reader and the card. There's one big caveat here. You have tens of thousands of readers, those are chart spots, and you have hundreds of thousands of cards. They all have to share the same key. Otherwise, it becomes way harder. This mechanism will not work. And most systems out there use this shared key. Now, it's true for public transportation as well. But in public transportation, the number of readers is 1% or 10% of the number of charge spots expected in the future. But it's also a problem for public transportation systems. So those shared keys are an issue. Now, if you recall, I also mentioned that one of the advantages of actually opening the charge station and connecting to the board there is that you'll be able to get the keys out. On the car, the keys are somewhat more protected. On the charge station, it becomes very hard to protect the keys. So this is a major challenge. There's one other aspect of symmetric keys. Symmetric keys also don't scale well if you want to have roaming. Now, with public transportation, you usually not use the same chart card, the same smart card in different countries. When you do charging and you want to drive from here to Belgium, you want to continue charging when you reach Belgium. So you have to have some type of roaming similar to cellular. And symmetric key used by all systems across Europe would not work, security-wise. That said, this would not be the only problem, because in real life, a lot because of cost issues, the algorithm used by smart cards are not very strong. So as I mentioned, the MyFair card used in the Dutch public transportation system has a proprietary encryption algorithm, or used to have until last year, called Crypto1, which is easily broken. Okay. Now, so that was about RFID cards. Let's move to the protocols. I focused now on the charge station itself. But if you move beyond the charge station, you'll get into its communication with the world, with the car, and with the web. Usually not directly, but with some control center in the middle. The issue with those protocols usually, and this is a real world example, I mean, there are probably two relevant protocols today in this world. One of them is actually Dutch by a consortium called ELAD, which is managing the charge stations in the Netherlands outside of Amsterdam, and another American by a company called ChargePoint. Both are naturally quasi-open, proprietary, without a lot of scrutiny. In this case, I need to say I didn't find a vulnerability, but it's a good exercise for you, because the documentation can be received if you ask for it. It's not open on the web. I did ask for the ChargePoint one around a week ago, and I'm reading it. I'll let you know if I find anything. There are other aspects beyond the protocol, the official protocol between the charge station and the control center, which sends those charge plans. And that's that it has to be managed remotely, because you want to lower the maintenance cost. And in a lot of cases, there's more than just the official protocol. For example, I said it's a Linux system. So in more than one implementation, I found that it's remotely accessible using SSH and SNMP, of course, because you want to fix it if something goes wrong. And then you get to SSH and SNMP challenges. Keep in mind that both SSH and SNMP can be secure, but there's a huge challenge around managing keys or passwords, depending on the technology, for a large amount of stations. So if you come from IT, you know that it's become a challenge when you have 100 servers. So now think about a situation where you have 10,000 machines that you need to sort of keep keys for. Either you have a very smart key management system, or that you use one key for all, which is way too common. Which means that if it gets to the internet, everything is open. One slide which is, well, there is one interesting thing here. This is web application security, so it's just to complete the picture, nothing new here. Those systems usually, I mentioned that the endpoint is that everyone wants to control charging from his phone. You know, how full is the car? How much did they pay? Please give me electricity now, even though you plan to give it only in an hour time, because I'm going to leave before I expected to. So there is a web aspect to that. Usually managed by either the charging provider or by the vendor of the charge stations. For example, GE, who is not a charging provider, have a cloud system that charge station owners and customers can connect to in order to those to sell services and those to buy services. Buy services meaning locate an available charge station, determine price, etc., etc. So this is an example of how the charge station owner would define the billing rules for anybody connecting to the charge station, of course available from his mobile app, which gets us back to mobile application security. A more interesting example I found was General Electric web service for third-party applications. So they have a web service that enables a third-party application to access their service and provide some features around the charge network. So that's their instructions as to how you would authenticate with your application. So you register to the GE website for that. You'll take the username and password and embed them in your application. Great security. Unfortunately, it's pretty common in this field because the risks that, I mean, it's a field in its infancy. You know, every bank or social network company has a lot of people working around securing web access. It's not GE main business after all. Lastly, probably, you know, maybe I should have started with that. The most disturbing part of things is going back to the physical side of things. The highest cost in running charging network is not the hardware, it's not even the electricity, it's maintenance. You know that manpower is, after all, at least in the West, the most costly thing. And therefore, maintenance procedures are a key part of any such system. And so I went and looked into how to maintain, again, a GE charge spot. And GE is not the worst company, just the company that provides the most information on the web, which is easy to pick on. And so I went into how do you manage their charge station. And it goes that way. You go and you open the box using a key. This key, physical, remember those? Is the last security mechanism you'll meet. You open the box and then you have to change the dip switch into configuration mode. Once you change the dip switch into configuration mode, you connect to the RJ45 socket with your computer. And most of the manual, by the way, is instructions for the maintenance guy how to configure his notebook for local connection. Then you open a browser, browse to 192.168.2.2, and you get the configuration interface. No, I didn't skip the password stage. There was no password stage. Now, of course, and I leave it as an exercise to all of you, some of the presenters here focus on this step. I wonder what would happen if you just run a scanner against this connection. How many other ports are open there? My guess is more than one. That's my experience with other systems, at least. I didn't check it on G, though. So if anybody ever gets to that, I'd love to hear the results. So maintenance is a key issue. Keep in mind that there should be tens or hundreds of thousands of these on the streets. You go, open, connect, and you're in. And keep in mind, and that sort of goes back to, and I'll go to a previous slide for a moment. If this protocol between the charge station and the control center is in any way not secure enough, or based on keys that are embedded in the charge station you just broke into, you get to the control center as well, which is crucial for the next set of slides. So those sort of were vulnerabilities. But vulnerabilities are not interesting, or they might be interesting. They don't provide any value to the hacker, so you won't do it. The main question is, what are the risks? What can really happen? And I'll go briefly over those. Those are stories. It's not technology anymore. It's just combining the dots. You can do it yourself, but it's worth mentioning. And I focus on those which are not trivial. So I'll probably skip privacy. I have a slide, but I'll skip through it, which is natural. And I'll skip billing fraud, so stealing money, which is also an easy scenario. I would like to mention two other scenarios which are more unique to charging stations. The first of all is denial of service, but not denial of computing service, denial of charging or power services. So keep in mind that if and when charging stations are becoming commonplace, we'll rely on them, such as we rely on gas stations today. And, in the third world, usually one of the worst things that can happen is a shortage of gas, with many people stuck in long lines. Now, if somebody can, even in a small area, prevent charging from everyone, you have a major disturbance to public life. If somebody can do it on a large scale, for example, find a way to change the firmware of all charge stations in a network, it might be a really, really big problem. Just to tie loose ends there, I mentioned SNMP being used to control charge stations. One of the main reasons is download firmware. So that's something to keep in mind. It's not just about charging cars, though. I mentioned that the reason to do smart charging is in order to make sure that everybody has electricity to charge. If somebody finds a way to confuse and make charge plans, to have too many cars charged at the same time, the denial of service is not anymore on just charging cars, it's on getting electricity in the first place. And a good example of that would be a local circuit in a company. You have 10, 15 cars, you make all of them charge at the same time. If the company was smart, just the breaker for that circuit would go down. If not, the building and all the workers will stop working. I said that I'll skip the stealing electricity part. I just want to mention here that every theft here is very small. It's only meaningful if somebody finds a way to steal a lot. There is, of course, identity theft and privacy. And then there's a huge question about electrocution, about safety. My experience is that usually this is not the issue, because when it gets physical, people tend to get smarter, they think more, which is an interesting thing to think about. Why? So the security between the controller and the electrical parts is usually more thought of. It's more regulated also. Okay, solutions for a minute. What should we do? It's not the focus of the presentation, but I need to mention that. First of all, at the end of the day, a lot of things here were about cost and proprietary protocols, if you think about it. So it's hard to fix cost and people saving money, but it's easy to fix protocols. So we want to make sure that more and more standardization is done in this field, and like always, I'm an open source guy. In order to be secure, it has to be open and scrutinized. And there's a whole list of protocols here around that. The other thing which is key to securing such systems is massive key management. I won't get into technologies around that here, but derived key is one of them. Public key cryptography is, of course, very useful. The only problem is it's usually more expensive on large scale. And lastly, like always, we just have to pay more attention and spend more money. Lastly, a few thoughts about the Internet of Things. So, we have heard here in this conference a series of talks about taking down planes, taking down the electric grid, taking down alarm systems, and it actually never happens. And the question is why? Why so many talks? Why so little hacking? I mean, there's tons of hacking, but it always goes back to banks and leaking user information. And it's a good question. It's worth discussing. So there are a few reasons I want to highlight. And you can see I did it last night because this is taken from a presentation in this conference. So one thing is that it's hard. A lot of those presentations were done by someone who is both a security expert and a subject matter expert. I worked 3 years doing electric charging stations. So I know something about it. I knew where to look. But a hacker, usually a web user, would hack websites. Now, this is not the place to say it, but because if you already came here, probably the smartest hackers, but most hackers are not smart. So there is a barrier to entry which is considerable. More than that, I think that in many cases you'll find that the hacking itself is complex. It seems simple on the slide, but it's not. I mentioned X-raying a smart card because it's hardware. It's harder to get into. And I mean, this is a nice slide for a presentation about encryption, but it hides all the details behind it. I've been yesterday, I mentioned, to an OWASP meeting, and those are smart people. Those are people who do application security, and the speaker before me, Jim Manico, will be able to hear later on here. He asked the people, who here is an encryption geek or somebody who understands encryption? And out of 80 people, around 4 people raised their hands. And a lot here is about encryption and proprietary encryption. So it's not easy. And those are just 2 examples. It's actually pretty hard. There's another issue though, and that gets back to where I live. Remember? 50 kilometers from Damascus, and I feel very safe. So there's the issue with the perceived risk. One way or another, people don't feel it's risky. I don't know why. They don't care about it. I'm not sure why. One of the reasons, of course, is that a lot of those technologies, not airplanes. I know airplanes are pretty successful these days, but a lot of the things we talk about are in their infancy. So we mentioned security in its infancy to a system in its infancy. There's a good question whether security for charging electric vehicles would mature before actual electric cars, the electric car market matures. Now, there's a more philosophical aspect to that. Maybe people are just good, they don't want to hack. And I do think that people are good and they don't want to hack. I think that people have a very different concept when it gets to be really physical. when it's software hacking and it's remote and it's banks and money, it's virtual. People do that. When it gets to be physical, people just don't do. I mean, whoever here did a bit of hacking in his past, and it's probably 80% or something like that, and I'm also, it's way back in my past, it's fun to hack a bank's website. It's not fun to hack an airplane. We have a very different mentality when it goes to the virtual world and to the physical world. And I think it's evolution. You know, we didn't adjust well enough yet psychologically and physically to the virtual world. On the physical world, we don't touch each other so much. We want our personal space. We are less violent. On the virtual world, we are much more violent, and we do a lot more. So that's why those things happen less. That said, going back to my specific case of charge stations, there is an issue there. We shouldn't be relaxing now. The risks are small, but they're aggregating, and taken together, they can, especially when you talk about nation states, can be pretty significant. And they do affect basic service, transportation, our ability to move from place to place. Now, they will become real when electric cars become real. So it's not now yet, but it might be too late by then, because those systems are systems that are put in blocks, in the streets, in hardware smart cards. They cannot be changed overnight. It's not your Windows system saying, I have patches, please install, or forcing you to patch. It's something that takes years to patch. So if we don't start today, it won't be secure when it's important in 10 years. And I mentioned I work around electric cars, so that's the next one, next year.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
We have some time for questions.
Yeah. Any questions?
A lot of the hacks you discuss involve physical access, and one thing I've been taught from very early on is, if you have physical access, all security is pointless. So how do you ever foresee that? If I have access to the electronics, even if you've encrypted the firmware, even if you've encrypted the memory, I can still get the key. There are many technologies.
We need to be smart. I'll give you one example I skipped because I sort of ran through it in the solutions part. Don't put any keys on the charge station. How would you do that? So it's actually a very interesting point. So I had the choice when designing those systems whether to put a key on the charge station or have authentication just when online. The risk here is that I will, when somebody comes, connects, and I have a connectivity problem, it'll get electricity without being authenticated. But I was willing to take this risk and maybe lose a bit of money in order not to compromise the keys and put them in the charge station. So your issue is very real, but we need to go over it, and we need to find a ways. The whole Internet of Things thing forces us to have security even though there is physical access, and we need to find the right balance and the right ways to do that.
So my main question was, for example, what is to prevent me from reflashing the device with my own firmware, primarily? How could you see preventing that? Because that's a really interesting attack for me.
I understand. In essence, we need to have a charge spot where it doesn't matter. I mean, you buy it. You can buy it yourself. You don't have to do it on the streets. It's becoming commodity. We need to make sure that the charge station has no role between the smart card and the center, more than locally. It can have role locally. So if you just manage to do something for local charging, there's nearly no way to prevent it. But we need to make sure that it's not a way to get to the center and not a way to duplicate the card.
Okay. Any other questions from the floor? Ofer will be around during the rest.
I'm here, yes. So feel free to come and ask.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.